All right, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome this evening Yotam Lurie, and we will have the honor to have him here with presenting on topic called ethical perspectives on regional sustainable development. He's from Ben-Gurion University of the Negev, Beer-Sheva, Israel, and it's also to be honest, also I would say a friend of mine, personally seen, not only a colleague, but it's quite a great possibility, I think, for all of us that he's sharing his profound knowledge, especially on the normative stuff, on the ethical perspectives, and of course combining it with the regional sustainable development. And this is something that is of quite of importance for us on environmental campus Birkenfeld. Yotam, I would shortly like to introduce you, if you allow, and then I can give you, I can give you then the word further. Yotam Lurie is an associate professor of business ethics in the Department of Management at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev in Israel. He served as the chair of the Department of Management and as the academic director of the executive and international MBA programs at the Clifford Glaser Faculty of Business and Management at Ben-Gurion University. He received his bachelor magna cum laude from the departments of philosophy and political science from Tel Aviv University, later studied at the Hebrew University before traveling as a Fulbright scholar to the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, where he earned his PhD in philosophy, specializing in pragmatism in 19th century European philosophy. He was a fellow of the program for the study criticism and interpretative theory at the University of Illinois. His current areas of research are in arenas of the philosophy of management and applied ethics. In particular, his research focuses on business and professional ethics, organizational ethics, and ethics in information technology. His publications have appeared in leading international journals, including the Journal of Business Ethics, Science and Engineering Ethics, and Meta-Philosophy. Hi, Yotam. Nice to have you here.
Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Milena, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to meet you. It's a pleasure to visit Germany from abroad this way and spend this evening with you. And thank you for those warm words of introduction, Milena. As Milena told you, in training, I'm a philosopher. And that basically means we talk about theory and we give too few examples. But since I'm a philosopher in the business school for many years now, for almost 20 years, I've been doing applied work both in professional ethics, technological ethics. And I do try to bring the philosophy closer to earth and further away from what we usually call German philosophy. What I want to talk to you today is about 3 ethical perspectives on sustainable development. And I will be talking in the second half of my lecture today about these 3 ethical perspectives, which I think add a lot to sustainable thinking, to sustainable development, to our understanding of sustainability. I'll put this more extremely. The bottom line of my lecture, the theme of my lecture, what I want to argue is that I can't understand how people do sustainability without thinking about these ethical issues, without thinking about how we move beyond the problem of the commons into what we call buried goods, without thinking how we balance the 3 P's of sustainability, without thinking about the values which are laden within sustainable development. And I'll talk here about Amartya Sen and development ethics. So these are 3 substantial contributions I would like to suggest about sustainability. And the bottom line argue, you can't do sustainability without thinking about ethics. Sustainability as a PR, the public relations slogan, sustainability as a high goal is not rich and thick enough if you don't look at the ethics. That's what I'm going to argue. But before I do this, I think I should, lay some common ground, because perhaps some of the people with us today in this talk have not heard enough about ethics, about philosophy, and about the theory standing behind sustainability. So before I get into these 3 theories, which will be my main theme, I want to say a few words of introduction about ethics and sustainability and how they come together. I hope this introduction won't be too basic and too rudimentary for everybody. I hope through this introduction, we can lay some common ground for the more advanced stuff and for what I want to suggest academically, theoretically for this issue. Normative philosophy, ethics, morality, values. I think everybody's familiar with the three big theoretical frameworks with the deontological ethics, teleological ethics, and virtue ethics. And the idea that these theoretical frameworks provide guidance, underpinning, and a better understanding of our thinking about right and wrong. I obviously won't get into these theoretical frameworks. These are the kind of things people do in academia, on campuses when we study ethics, these three theoretical frameworks. More broadly speaking, the notion of ethics, and you can distinguish between ethics and morality, between ethics and value. I will be using them synonymously here as being the same thing, have different values underpinning them. We can talk about integrity. We can talk about honor, honesty, moral principles, fairness, justice, conscience. These are all ethical terms. These are all normative terms. And what we do in ethical theory and in applied ethics is we work with these concepts and with these theoretical frameworks in applied settings. And what Milena was, and through Milena's introduction, she said, I'm doing business ethics these days, which means I take these theoretical concepts and I apply them in various situations within the business world. But we can apply these concepts and these theoretical frameworks also in the context of family, ethics of the family, ethics of work, ethics of organizations, professional ethics, etc., etc. So as ethicists doing applied ethics, we use ethical theories and ethical concepts within applied contexts. And the idea is to help us understand these contexts better, to give us insight about the values, about the conflicts, about the disagreements, about what's at stake. I'm not sure that people who do ethics are experts about right and wrong, about what is the right thing to do in every ethical situation, in every applied situation. But I think we are in a situation to give insight and look at the situation in a richer context. In recent years, I've been doing a lot of work about sport ethics, about gender in sports, about fair competition, about doping issues. I've been doing a lot of work about ethics of technology and where technology affects our lives as human beings, overtaking our jobs. So there are many contexts where the ethicist comes in with these tools and looks at applied context. Let's move on. What I want to talk today about ethics of sustainable development. That's the topic. And I think it's important to see that when we're talking about ethics of sustainable development, this is really the most basic introduction I can give to this issue. When we're talking about ethics of sustainable development, we're talking basically about a combination of three things. And I want to say a few words about each of these three things before moving into my lecture itself. Ethics of sustainability has to do with people living in a certain environment on Earth with environmental concerns and according to a certain timeline. And I think from an ethical perspective, the amazing thing about sustainability is that we have to think about these people on Earth with earthly concerns, with environmental concerns, looking into the future. Let's move forward and to look into each of these three parameters, each of these concerns, the people, the environment, and the future. Let's start with the people. This is what we mean with the people. This nice picture of many people is actually a combination of multiple stakeholders. And each stakeholder has a different interest. Each stakeholder has different concerns. Each stakeholder has different goals in mind, and they're trying to come together. People coming to the business school are familiar with the stakeholder model. But when we're talking about sustainability, the stakeholders are much broader than just the stakeholders of the firm. We're talking about minorities, about NPOs, NGOs, suppliers, local government, temporary workers, many different stakeholders which come into play within these multiple stakeholders. And again, people coming from the business school who are familiar with the stakeholder model know that what's important about stakeholders are two things. And this is really an introduction for people coming from more technological department or faculties. When we're talking about stakeholder, we're talking about the fact that on the one hand, we're all in the same boat, which means if we want to sail to success and we want to reach land, and if we want our organization, our country, our planet to flourish, we have to remember that we're doing this together. And there's no chance that only one of the people in this boat will reach land and the other will drown. If the boat drowns, everybody will drown. If you rock the boat, we'll all fall off the boat. So the idea that we're all in the same boat and we're all in the same storm is fundamental to this notion of stakeholder theory. The second feature of the multiple stakeholder model is that there's interdependence between the various stakeholders. The character at the bottom show this very well. The delivery man comes into the shop, and if the delivery man wouldn't come into the shop, the nice lady wouldn't be able to buy her coffee. And the timeliness of the delivery man and the quality of the supplies the delivery guy brings in and the kind of work which takes place in the shop is what allows the shop owner to sell this lady her cup of coffee or whatever he's selling her. They're interconnected, they're interdependent, and the satisfaction of the interest of the lady who's buying coffee and of the shop owner and of the supplier are interconnected. For each one of them to flourish, the other has to do their job successfully, has to do their role successfully. Their interests are intertwined and they depend on one another. So when we're talking about stakeholder model, we're talking basically about these two features, about being the same boat and having an interdependence. Again, people within the business school who study this model as a model for project development, for strategy, or for ethics, know that what's important in the stakeholder model is to see that since they're interdependent, finding the right balance between the various stakeholders is what's important for managers, for organizations, for countries, for project managers, and in development strategy. Finding the right balance. How? In the business school, people study tools about how to find the right balance. What we do in ethics, we ask what interests those, what is imbalance? What interests more important? What the difference between these interests? So one of the features of what I call the multiple stakeholder independence is the fact that it's all in the same boat and we're interdependent. That was feature number one. Second feature, time, the timeline, the future. You know, way back in the 1960s or 70s, people in my discipline doing ethics had a wonderful, an amazing revelation. And that revelation is what made sustainability possible. Suddenly people discovered, we have responsibilities not just to our families and friends, not just to our communities and countries, not just to our businesses and occupations. We have responsibilities, ethical responsibilities towards people who don't exist yet, future generations. And, those of us who are older remember that amazing revelation about how can I have a responsibility to a person who's still in potential, a person who's not here yet, a person who might not be here. What does it mean to have a responsibility to people in the future? And the idea was that the present generation might perhaps be living in an overdraft and using the resources of the earth in a way which future generations will have to pay for it. We call this negative externalities. And due to this understanding that today we have a responsibility to people who have not been born yet, and to people who might potentially be born in 20, 30, 40, or 100 years, we have to live our lives in a way which would make it possible for them to have the same quality of life as we have. And if you're living in an overdraft, you're overusing the resources of the earth, whether it's water, air, or land, or food, and then future generations will have a problem. So the second feature of what I call the ethics of sustainability is not only balancing the different stakeholders and not only seeing that the different stakeholders are intertwined and all the same boat, but thinking about how these stakeholders have responsibility to future generations. And in what way can we live our lives so as not to endanger future generations and enable them to have the same quality of life as we have today? That was amazing, which means I remember when I studied it for the first time, environmental ethics, the idea that, people are not here, put an obligation on us. This is the second feature I wanted to talk about. The third feature, I think is familiar to everybody today, and the fact that people, the multiple stakeholders, have to have a place to live. And this place is called planet Earth. And again, the environmental ethics was born somewhere in the 60s. And since then, the understanding that we have responsibilities to the earth and to the environment, and issues of global warming, and issues of climate change, and issues of pollution are issues which are going to affect all of us. And hence, we have to think not only about our obligations to people, multiple stakeholders, as I called it, and not only of our obligations to future generations, but also our obligations to the land, our obligations to the streams, to the trees, to planet Earth, to climate warming. So, from an ethical perspective, people who were born and raised on the religion, on the monistic religions and obligations to other people, and thinking about ethics just in terms of you and me, and of community and family and relations to other human beings, these three changes, multiple stakeholders, future generations, and environment, created a huge shift in ethics. And that's how basically sustainability was born, out of these three changes and these three huge ethical changes. I'm sure this is obvious to everybody, but it's important for at least to mention it. There are very many different domains of sustainability. And when I was preparing this lecture, I looked at this wonderful public lecture series and the different topics you guys have been listening to. And there's sustainable issues in tourism, and sustainable energy, and sustainable region, and sustainability of organizations and environment. And we have different domains of sustainability. I mentioned this in order to say that each of these domains, each of these areas, basically brings into the algorithm, into consideration, a new set of values. Because if we're doing sustainable tourism, then we have to take into concern multiple stakeholders, future generations, the earth, and what it means to do ethical tourism. If we're talking about sustainable energy, then again, we have to take these three concerns with energy, same for region and so forth. So my argument, what I was trying to suggest in this lecture, is that sustainability requires ethics. Sustainability requires ethics in several different senses. It requires ethics in the sense of balancing these different domains. It requires ethics in the sense of balancing between the people, the environment, and what it means to do development here. We're talking about economic values, social values, environmental values, and specific domain-related values. So I can't understand how people do work in sustainability without bringing into consideration ethical concerns. Because what ethics basically gives us the tools in order to deal with how to aggregate these different values, how to balance these different values, how to check which of these values is more and less important, and where that conflict exists within them. I'm sure the people who do work in sustainable tourism or in sustainable cities are basically looking at how these values come into balance. But I think, therefore, that the tools of ethics are very important in order to be able to do this well, to do this with knowledge, to do this in an insightful manner. So the theme of my argument is that ethics basically enhances sustainability. And I think you will be doing better work in sustainability if you bring into your thinking ethical tools, balancing and aggregating between the spheres. And within each of these spheres is an ethical issue of considering the different values. And thus, thinking about values and thinking about ethics can add to our understanding of sustainability. And people who are doing work in sustainability are not just doing technical work and not just doing work about developing new products or a new policy or new ways of thinking about the world. We're doing work in ethics. We're doing work in ethics. We're thinking how to balance and aggregate these different values. Hence, I want to talk to you a bit more about the three ethical perspectives on sustainable development. So these are, as I said, words of introduction to put us all on the same page. And what I want to do now in the second half of my talk is look a little bit more in depth at each of these three perspectives, because I think they bring a lot of insight to what we're doing in thinking about sustainability and our understanding of sustainability. The first ethical perspective I want to talk about, I draw from Garrett Hardin's classical Tragedy of the Commons. And what Garrett Hardin told us in the Tragedy of the Commons, there's a notion of what we call common pool resources. The example Garrett Hardin used is the example of a grazing field, a shared grazing field. And when we're talking about these shared common resources, such as grazing lands, unregulated grazing lands, or ocean fisheries, or firewood, which a community has, a group has in common, people use in common, it's very important not to overuse them. And Garrett Hardin's argument was there's what he called the tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of the commons comes into play when one of the people using these common pool resources overuses it. And when this one person overuses these common pool resources, it's to his advantage. He gets more of these resources. But the upshot is that everybody pays a price for this. So think about a grazing land. We all have cows grazing this common pool resource, grazing this field. And we're at a good balance between the amount of hay the cows have, the amount of food the cows have, and each one of the people in the community has 2 or 3 cows, and it's all working fine and dandy. Now, if I want to make more money, if I want to make more milk, if I want to have more meat, I'll bring 2, 3 extra cows into this field. The upshot is I will earn more money, but our shared field will go dry, and there will be too many cows for this common resource. This is what Garrett Hardin called the tragedy of the commons. And as an economist, from an economic perspective, it's a tragedy because since the common pool resource, when individuals act according to their own self-interest, short-term self-interest, they take advantage of the common pool resources, and we all pay a price in the long run. This issue of common resources has been discussed in depth by Elinor Ostrom, the political economist, the American political economist, and she won her Nobel Prize basically for work about how to govern the commons. And her idea was that the only way to govern the commons, or one of the right ways to govern the commons, is basically through rules, which means because rules and small communities, I'll put it more clearly. Because this is a common pool resource, and because people are self-interested and think only of their short-term advantages, basically common pool resources are bound to go dry and are bound to give an advantage to the self-interested economic agent who takes advantage of these resources and does not take into consideration the community as a whole. So Eleanor also did many experiments trying to demonstrate that within small communities, this is less of a problem. And within smaller communities, there's more trust and adjustment of norms within the community. But nonetheless, rules are important. How does this come into sustainability? It comes to sustainability because basically what Garrett Hardin demonstrated that we have to manage these common resources in one way or another in order to reach long-term survival. I wanted to look at this a bit more in depth, and I think there's something very problematic about this notion of the common pool resources. And the ethical perspective I want to suggest here is to think in a broader sense about the community. And when these economists, these political economists, like Garrett Hardin and Ostrom, look at common pool resources, they think only about economic agents, economic actors taking advantage of these common resources. But as we all know, and as we learned, I think even from the COVID-19 experience we're having these past half year, past months, our interconnection as a community is much stronger than these common pool resources. And our sense of interaction and sense of togetherness and reliance on one another within a community is much stronger. And the title of this lecture series is Regional Sustainable Development. So think a bit more in depth about what it means to be part of a region and the notion of community, which comes out of the notion of a region. Take lessons for the COVID-19 situation. If your neighbors are ill, the community at whole will be a COVID hotspot. It would be a high-risk red zone, and everybody's freedoms will be affected. I'm not sure how it works in Germany, but I know that many other places, such as in my country, in the US, and several other places, um, there's not one policy for the whole country. And the way your neighbor behaves and the amount of people who are affected with the COVID-19 virus affects how hard the lockdown is. So your neighbor's behavior affects our neighbor's behavior affects each one of us. And if our neighbors protect themselves and are healthy, the community as a whole will have an advantage. And if our neighbors don't protect themselves and take risks and are affected by the virus, our freedoms will all be affected. But I think the COVID-19 situation brought us even a stronger sense of community. There was a lot of panic, I remember, way back in March and April when the numbers of people hospitalized went up. And people started worrying all over the world about what will happen when they come to the hospital. Will they have a bed? Will they have a ventilator? And again, we see through this issue of the COVID-19 situation the fact that we're not just talking about about common pool resources. Our notion of community is much stronger than just common pool resources. So when you, as a citizen, as a member of a community, are concerned with the fact that perhaps when you reach the hospital, you won't have a ventilator and you won't have a bed, or the doctor will be too busy, we're looking at resources, health resources, which are much broader and not just common pool resources. And our reliance on one another is not the reliance on common pool resources. So I think one of the problems with the things I showed you about Garrett Hardin and Eleanor Ostrom about common pool resources is that they're thinking about one type of good, what they call the common good resources. As economists, their notion of good is divided between public good, private good, club good, and what they call common pool resources. As human beings, as members of a community, we share more than just grazing fields. We share more than just pool fisheries. We share more than just common pool resources. One of the things we share, for example, is a health system. One of the things we share is a sewage system, electronic system, jobs, communication networks, transportation system, good roads, good trains. We share an infrastructure. And the infrastructure which we share, the economists call it merit goods. But what's important with these merit goods is these are goods that generate substantial positive externalities, which means once these goods are in supply and once we have access to these goods, many good stuff comes out of it. For example, if we have a good health system and people are less often hospitalized and live healthier lives, then they can be perhaps more productive at work. They can be perhaps more productive, have healthier family lives, live better lives. They can enjoy parks. So a good health system affects other issues and brings other goods into play. In the same way, a good education system or a good transportation system makes other things possible, other goods possible. A good communication network, internet, phones, high-speed internet makes access to knowledge better. So these are things we share as a community. The things we share as a community is not just the common pool resources. As a community, we share what we call these merit goods: education, museum, healthcare, parks, communication systems, water sewages, post offices, access to jobs, good paying jobs. And these things bring about other goods about them. A positive externality is a benefit that is enjoyed by a third party, but enjoyed by everybody in the community due to this infrastructure, these merit goods. And I think when we're talking about sustainability, too much of the focus has been put on the type of goods which Garrett Hardin has spoken of, common pool resources. But it's not a one or another, and these things are intertwined. And when people develop a strong sense of community through education systems, through health programs, then the merit goods and the positive externalities which come from these merit goods play a much stronger role. Um, so I think we all learned by practical experience through this experience of COVID-19 that we share many common interests. And the picture of the boat with the people on the boat, which I showed you at the beginning of the lecture, about the common about we're all in the same boat, comes into play not only with the COVID-19 situation, not only in the case of an epidemic, but it comes into play in the case of what type of education do we have, what type of jobs are available to us, what type of open space available to us. These are merit goods. These are not common pool resources. And as merit goods, these are things which bring us together as human beings and bring to the fore our common interests and our shared collaboration. And I think, coming down to this lecture series which you have, uh, these are things which community or a region share in common. And I saw a lot of sense, therefore, in the fact that this lecture series focuses on regional sustainability and not just on any type of sustainability. Because as human beings sharing planet Earth, it's a bit far to see how planet Earth is a good which we all share and a merit good which brings about other advantages. But in the case of infrastructure, in the case of merit goods, in the case of avoiding situations such as COVID-19, it's much stronger and much more evident. Uh, this was what I called ethical perspective number one. If I'll sum it up and conclude what I tried to argue here, I tried to argue that a lot of what goes on in economic thinking about sustainability and common pool resources is very narrow. And it's narrow because economists don't understand how we're intertwined together as a community. And we're intertwined, interconnected as a community through our common interests and not just through our common pool resources. We're intertwined the community through the merit goods which bring us together, which make life in the community a good life and a valuable life. So we have to move from self-interested economic actors to communities and human beings which share healthcare, public parks, jobs, electric systems, communication, access to journalism, all these positive externalities, and this makes sustainability much stronger. Ethical perspective number two. The second ethical perspective I wanted to bring to the fore talks about how we balance the three P's. The three P's, the profit, the people, and the planet. And this is a discussion which has been going on in ethical literature basically since the 80s of the previous century, when we met the discussion between what it was called those days the preservation position and the conservation position, or the preservation versus conservation debate. In the US, the two folks which represented this most strongly were John Muir, who was the founder of the Sierra Club, and Gifford Pinochet, who was one of the founders of the U.S. Forest Service. What was the debate between the preservation position and the conservation position in the old days, in the progressive area? It was between protection of forests and using forests as an economic engine. One of the stories which is told here is about how Walt Disney, a huge organization, wanted to purchase part of the U.S. forest, an area of the U.S. forest around the upper West Coast, and build there a park. And when the Disney company, when Walt Disney came to the U.S. Forest Service, they said, "Look, you have a lot of trees, a lot of forest areas, and we will develop them, and we will make it more accessible to citizens, to people, and it would be more profitable to everybody. And we can use this forest area as an economic engine to give more people more access, more good by using it in a proper way." So Gifford Pinochet, as the CEO of the U.S. Forest Service, was very willing to sell, rent, turn over part of the beautiful forest of the northwest coast of the U.S. to the Disney company in order to open there a Disney amusement park. Against him got up John Muir and the Sierra Club and said, look, the fact that you'll make more money um, by having an amusement park, a Disney amusement park in this forest is fine, but we have a right to this tree as human beings, as citizens. And by turning it into an amusement park, you're basically um, taking it away from people who want to use it in a different way. Uh, the preservation position was protect the trees first and not at the expense of turning it into something more profitable and more accessible to other human beings. The argument between what's called the conservation position, which is use nature to create more good, and the preservation, which is protect it as is and keep it in its purest form, is a classical argument within the progressive area between these two positions. And this argument about what does it mean to protect the environment, how much it should be purist in protecting the environment, and what does it mean to protect our environment but make it more accessible, more profitable, more usable, make more good out of it, is a central argument. I think this argument is about how we balance the three P's, because what the conservation position is basically saying, balancing the three P's, is thinking how human beings, how people will make the most out of the forest. And the preservation position comes and say, balancing the three P's is protecting the forest as a forest, and not letting human beings abuse the forest by turning it into a Disney amusement park. We saw this same kind of situation in Israel over the last, I think, 15 or 20 years. But I think every country sees these kind of arguments about how we balance the people P and the planet P. In our case, we have beautiful coasts facing the Mediterranean Sea. And, when I was a kid many years ago, these were bare coasts, and you could just walk barefoot on the white sand and enjoy the ocean, the Mediterranean Sea. And slowly but surely, people who abide by what I call the conservation position argued for developing the shoreline, and developing our access to the ocean. And they started building walkways and boardwalks and stores and marinas and high-rising buildings and restaurants looking out to the shore. And the argument was people would be able to enjoy the shore, the sea better, enjoy the shore better if they have access to it, if they have parking lots, if they have a boardwalk, if they have a nice restaurant facing the beach. And the argument emerged in Israel. We don't have the kind of force they have in the U.S. Between those who wanted to develop the shoreline, to allow more people to enjoy it, to make it more accessible to more people and more interest groups, versus those who were curious who said any kind of development is abuse of nature, and it hurts, and it goes against our obligation to the planet to keep it in its purest and clearest form. So we've seen that argument, and as you could expect, I think the purists have lost, and we see less and less pure natural access to the beach, to the sea, to the shore, and more border walks, restaurants, hotels, and more technological access to the beach. So this argument is a classical argument which comes up in very many different forms. Today, we see this argument in what's called the new conservation debate, the parks versus the people debate, nature first, nature in its purest form first, or nature and human beings together. Is it a human right, even if you are on a wheelchair, and even if what you want to do in the beach is sit in a high-rise building and look into the ocean? Is that part of your right, or is keeping nature in its purest form was the right thing? The nature first people today, it's called people who go for protection for the biodiversity and the right of every type of species to go on existing, and our obligation to protect every type of species, no matter what, in far-off region, versus what's called the social conservatives, social conservationists, who talk about developing the forest the seas, the beach, in order to make it more accessible to more people. Why is that right? Because it brings in more of the multiple stakeholders, which I spoke about, and takes into consideration more of the interests of the multiple stakeholders. So you see here a classical case of an argument about how to balance which P has priority, the people P or the park P or the planet P. How do we balance between the people P and the planet P in the proper way? And taking a step back, they're all for sustainability. Whether you think about you're purist about nature, or whether you want to make nature more accessible and useful to more people, and allow the stakeholders to fulfill their interest in nature, it can be seen as a sustainable position. So it's not that one party here is for sustainability and the other is against sustainability. These are different ways of thinking about sustainability, different ways of taking into account sustainability. Should we prioritize nature protection or human nature within the conservation projects? It's an open question. Without an ethical discussion about these values, we won't get anywhere. So this was the second ethical perspective I wanted to bring to the fore. It's an ethical perspective on how we balance these different P's together. And I don't understand how we can do sustainable development within any context if we don't look in depth at balancing the values within these P's and looking at the different shades and aspects of these types of sustainability. The third and last perspective I want to bring to the fore and discuss is about the development, the ethics of development. And it's a mistake to think that there's either economic development or sustainable development. The notion of development is value laden, which means what type of development are we talking about? And there's not just two types of development. There are many types of development. And I think we in the sustainability movement, in the sustainability business, are missing something when we think about just about the sustainable development as a simple term. And I want again to suggest that we bring to the fore and add into our thinking about sustainable development some insight from Amartya Sen's development ethics. Amartya Sen is also a Nobelist in economics, and he developed what's called the human flourishing index. Amartya Sen, together with Martha Nussbaum, developed a human flourishing index. And if I put the conflict in the simplest terms I can, there's a conflict here between how the sustainability project thinks about development, ability to meet the needs of the present and the future through the 17 SDGs, where the main term is needs. What we develop is our ability to meet needs of the present and needs of the future. And what the 17 SDGs define is how we fulfill these needs for food, these needs for clean air, these needs for clean water. So the main focus here is needs. In contrast, and I think it adds a lot to understand sustainability, Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum talk about development of capabilities and functioning. Capabilities and functioning that serve human and communal flourishing, well-being, and freedom. And both the notion of needs and an ethics of needs and an ethic, as well as an ethics of capability and functions, are two ethical perspectives on what it is that we're trying to develop. I think, or I want to suggest, that perhaps when we talk about sustainable development, which is totally focused on needs of the present without compromising the future, perhaps it's a bit of a narrow perspective. And perhaps we can aim for more and look at more. And what Amartya Sen is suggesting is that the development ethic should be based on capabilities and developing human capabilities, which are part of what he calls human flourishing and human functioning. And looking at the human capabilities according to the capabilities having to do with health, with education, with living standards, which allow people to achieve their freedoms and get a higher level of human development. So again, I'm not opposed to the notion of sustainable development, which focuses on need. But I do think we will have a richer notion of sustainable development if we think about development capabilities, human capabilities, which differ from culture to culture, from economic situation to economic situation, which are related to the community, which are related to the well-being and the goals of the people, which in the bottom line have to do with freedoms. Freedoms having to do with the health of the people, with years of education and expected schooling which people get, and of course, with the living standard which people can reach through these goals. So what I spoke about are basically, I'll move forward. What I spoke about basically three ethical perspectives about sustainability, which I try to suggest bring insight and depth to sustainability, and in turn, and can help us make sustainability less of, and turn sustainability from just a good PR, public relations slogan, from a project into something which we can actually work out at balancing and aggregating the different values. Ethical inquiry, as I argued, is essential for sustainability because it can add to the process of finding sustainable solutions. Finding sustainable solutions by balancing and aggregating the people values, the planet values, the specific domain values, and understanding what type of development we're looking for. First, I looked at how we move from common goods to merit goods, and how we share much more than common pool resources. Second, I looked at how the discussion about balancing the three Ps came into play in the part versus people debate between social conservationists and nature purists. And finally, I talked about development and argued that in development, we have to move beyond developing which meets the needs of the future and the present to development which meets capabilities and functionings and allows for richer human freedoms. So there's the three topics which I tried to spell out and discuss. And I think this is a great place to stop and ask for questions, comments, and thank you all for your time.